There's rumours of a thermobaric bomb, which is a sort of vacuum bomb, which, to be fair, the US has used before in Afghanistan, but the idea of it being used in Europe is stomach churning. And
now with the Russians marching in, it's changed the calculus entirely. Tens of thousands of people have tried to flee the city. There will be many more. People are hiding out in bomb shelters. But this isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen. So it's partly human nature, but they are not in denial.
Well, at least he chose his words carefully, Michael, right?
Yeah, I don't see how anyone could be offended by that.
Yeah, no, I don't see that either. I did like how, of course, that CBS News reporter was talking about, it's not like Iraq or Afghanistan, which, are war zones because of the United States, the country he lives in. But anyway, that's just part of the Western media's insane and somewhat racist coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We're going to go through that today. Of course, me and Michael, we both disavow the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right?
Yes, I think that invading other countries is bad.
Yes, I agree. And of course, anyone can tell you it's bad and all. But what has been really interesting for me watching the coverage of the invasion is just how illuminating it has been for people like myself who all suspect certain things about the Western media. Do they have biases in terms of, skin colour, the people affected, the people actually doing the war, etc., etc. And I think this past week and a bit has shown, yes, that is probably the case. So first off, Michael, we're going to get into the hypocrisy of the media in the West, because there is this, narrative that has been purported by the media that when the United States, the United Kingdom, or one of its allies, invades a sovereign nation, it's done for the right reasons. But when Russia does it, well, that's something else entirely. And I think that attitude is shown very well with this video of Condoleezza Rice discussing the invasion of Ukraine. Let's have a watch.
Well, and I have argued that when you invade a sovereign nation, that is a war crime. I mean, I think we're at just a real basic point there.
Well, I'd agree. It is certainly against every principle of international law and international order. And that's why throwing the book at them now in terms of economic sanctions and punishments is also a part of it. And I think the world is there. Certainly NATO is there. He's managed to unite NATO in ways that I didn't think I would ever see again after the end of the Cold War.
Really?
Yeah.
The double standards, Michael, the double standards. Can you believe it?
Well, that Condoleezza Rice person sounds like a real anti-war protester, a real pacifist there.
Well, she's not, Michael. Would it surprise you to know that she was responsible for the 2003 invasion of Iraq, a sovereign nation, by the United States? Yeah, and again, that's the most blatant example. It's just shocking that a video like that can happen. And credits that Fox News anchor who maybe didn't know who Condoleezza Rice was saying that, just owning her. But I don't know. I don't think that was the case, unfortunately. And yeah, that's just the most blatant example of, hey, Russia, you can't do it, but when we do it, well, it's about freedom and liberty and all of that bullshit that was peddled 19 years ago. Also, I want to play this video now of Jeremy Vine, Michael. Jeremy Vine.
Oh, yes.
Showing his lack of sympathy for Russian troops in just the most blatant way possible. Have a listen.
What's your problem with fighting Russians if they've invaded Ukraine? What's your problem with doing that?
Russia were our allies.
Yeah, but that's then.
The people of Russia are not our enemies. And I don't think they're the enemies. Quite a number of those Russians you probably find will go across, and they were holding their hands up this morning, not wanting to fight, showing the Ukrainians.
Yeah, but if
they were told lies by Putin, surprise, surprise.
True, but the brutal Bill. The brutal reality is, if you put on a uniform for Putin and you go and fight his war, you probably deserve to die, don't you?
Do you? Do kids deserve to die? 18, 20, called up, conscripted?
That's life.
Who don't understand it?
That's the way it goes.
Who don't grasp the issues?
Yep. Well,
this is not just the brutality of war.
I mean, that's just like the way he just says, you probably deserve to die. Yeah, I agree with you. I think you said, lack of empathy, lack of consideration for the lives of these human beings. It's pretty scary. But I guess they are Russians, so,
Yeah, they're Russians, so they're the enemy, so they deserve to die, basically. Even though, like the caller said, they've just been literally, conscripted, and they have to fight in this war, and they don't really know about the geopolitical ramifications at all. And of course, like every American or British troop that goes and, dies in the Middle East, it's the most horrific tragedy ever. And I don't think it's bad to say, hey, troops shouldn't die, but it's incredible, like the lack of, again, empathy, just the lack of vision for this war, and the people who actually are doing the fighting aren't the same as the ones who are literally starting the war. It's incredible. And again, the hypocrisy between how our troops are treated and Russian troops, just troops on the ground, the ones that are getting killed every day, is crazy. Also, I want to point out more from Britain, this BBC News headline, which is titled, "Would Putin press the nuclear button?" Would Putin do that? Now, contrast that headline, and basically the article talks about Putin like he's a deranged madman for maybe wanting to press it. When the media, including the BBC, asked that question of Labour leaders, the answer is meant to be unequivocally yes, I would press the nuclear button. But when the Russians do it, oh well, they're deranged madmen, aren't they?
Yeah, it's so weird that obviously Jeremy Corbyn was so insistent on stressing that basically just he kind of rejected the question of would he press the nuclear button, because of course it's just a stupid, gross question to ask somebody who's going to be the leader of the country, because it's just not worth considering. And yet when Putin talks about it, they're like, oh, he shouldn't be talking about that, that's terrifying and scary. And it's like, that was Corbyn's point.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it just goes to this whole section, the hypocrisy. Yeah, when the crazy Russians do it, well, that's awful. When we do it, shows we're serious. Like if a political leader doesn't say they press the nuclear button, well, they're not fit to lead a country. But anyway, Michael, you had a bit more to talk about regarding the West, didn't you?
Yeah. So basically, first of all, I think it's worth noting that the West is also hypocritical. I mean, we've already mentioned the fact that the West obviously has already engaged in lots of different kind of military actions across the world, which have been plenty objectionable. But of course, I mean, imagine how the West would react, and also even just the media within the West would react if China, for example, was trying to influence Mexico to be geopolitically on their side. I'm sure that the West wouldn't hesitate to try to come up with some justification for involving themselves in Mexico, their smaller neighbor, because they like to maintain their own geopolitical sphere of influence.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like every sensible centrist, and of course right wing and even left of centre, person would be like, oh yeah, no, we've got to invade Mexico before, China signs them into their alliance or whatever that may be. Yeah, they would be calling for war every single day, and they just wouldn't see the hypocrisy at all of it, obviously.
But also, I've seen people respond to the hypocrisy charge by being like, well, just because the West did bad things in the past, it doesn't make what Russia's doing okay. And of course that's true, but I came out of a phrase which I think describes the attitude of a lot of people, and especially the media, which is they're idealists when another country does something, but when the West does something, they're realists. So in other words, when the West needs to defend their geopolitical interests, it's the West has to do it, they have to go out there. But when another country does that, goes to defend their geopolitical interests, suddenly they're all talking about, the ideals of what's the right thing to do, and saying, well, if you invade a sovereign country, that's a war crime.
Yeah, no, exactly. And honestly, it's been quite incredible to see the Western media against war. It's the first time I think I've seen it in my lifetime. The West is actually against war and saying that a war should stop. And yeah, it's been really remarkable to see the switch. But I also want to talk about the West's coverage of the Ukrainian people. When the Ukrainians stand up to their oppressors, in this case the Russians, it's heroic. And I think that can be shown by this ITV News report on Molotov cocktail making in Ukraine. So have a watch.
Perhaps you were thinking originally. There are hundreds and hundreds of people here in Dnipro who have come to the center of town, and they are in the process here in this section of making Molotov cocktails. You see them, they're taking styrofoam, they've sort of grated the styrofoam, and they're now putting it into the bottles. The styrofoam works to make the Molotov cocktail sticky, to help it stick to vehicles, to other targets as well. You can see them grating it. and they're making it according to a recipe that has been distributed by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Really quite extraordinary.
Yeah, so really quite extraordinary there. Ordinary citizens standing up to their oppressors, making these weapons. I do think, though, Michael, I think I've seen different coverage of this kind of situation when Palestinians do it. A very serious reporter will talk about the conflict, say, in Palestine and, Israel just kind of, oppressing them and, the troubles with both sides and, both sides share the blame for the situations and the Palestinians throwing rocks at Israeli tanks, they're inflaming the situation. But, when it's in Ukraine, yeah, like those Molotovs, guys, the BBC, they were doing it as well, on the BBC News at 10 one night. And they were so excited that regular people were doing this. And, they didn't think that the Ukrainians were violent animals for doing this, that they, there was something inherently violent about these people. And it was pretty clear, like, hey, this is something, like I said, that's heroic that these ordinary civilians are doing. The contrast between Ukraine and how it's being treated under Ukrainian citizens and ordinary Palestinian citizens is quite dramatic, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I feel like the West often likes to imagine that when kind of the people are rising up, they are sort of on the West side implicitly, and then the West will just ignore all the times when they're actually the oppressive force globally that are opposing kind of popular resistance movements. And of course, definitely the resistance to the Israeli occupation in Palestine is most definitely a popular resistance movement where the West just likes to ignore the fact that they're clearly on the side of the kind of authorities putting down the people rising up, and even casts, obviously, as you said, moral judgment against the Palestinians when they wouldn't in lots of other situations.
Yeah, I know. And also, just a bit more on the contrast between Palestine and Ukraine and how it's treated. Russia has, of course, been banned from Eurovision for invading Ukraine.
Oh, yeah.
But in 2019, Eurovision took place in Israel, or should I say in Palestine, because it was on top of a cleansed Palestinian village. That was where the arena was built. And, that was completely fine. And that gets us neatly into another topic, which is racism. The outright racism of the Western media while reporting on Ukraine. It's like, well, why do the Palestinians get treated differently to the Ukrainians? And I think this last week and a bit's coverage of the Ukrainian invasion has been an eye-opener. Of course, we saw at the beginning of the video the clip of the CBS News reporter saying, hey, these people are civilized, not like Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's a lot of implications of that. And we've got a bunch more videos that demonstrate that that wasn't a one-off comment, that this is a narrative that many in the Western media do believe. So let's go to this clip from ITV first.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
It's Robert Moore here in the studio.
The unthinkable, Michael, the unthinkable. A developed nation in Europe. Wow. And here's the thing, it's not just, kind of racist, obviously, but, like 5 years before the war in Iraq, the Balkans had been at war for like half a decade.
Yeah.
And it's incredible how these journalists just have goldfish brains. Or maybe, the Balkans doesn't count. Maybe it's the exception that proved the rule kind of thing. And of course, the Middle East is at war all the time with each other. But as we said, it's mainly because of the influence of countries like the United States is why Iraq and Afghanistan have had wars that went on for decades. But anyway, Michael, talk to me about that clip. Do you agree that it's unthinkable that something like this would happen in Europe?
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe you could say one of the consequences of the West having projected power through invasions to, against countries halfway across the world is that we in the West like to think that this kind of stuff could never happen to us or anybody who looks like us. When you've got a narrative that people fighting half the world away are defending our freedom, the idea that anybody could actually ever have to fight a war on European or Western soil is unthinkable. And obviously, while Ukraine isn't really in the West, they are European and white, which I think a lot of the time is what the West means.
Yeah, and Australian. Yeah. That's why Australia are in the West as well, because they're white. But and you're right. The war is very much seen as not our problem; it's their problem, of course, which we do foist upon them. Another evidence of this racism in the Western media is from Daniel Hannan, who said Vladimir Putin's monstrous invasion is an attack on civilization itself. Britain and the West must come to terms with the loss of influence and the worldwide retreat of democracy. Of course, democracy isn't retreated when the UK government passes laws banning peaceful protests with punishment with up to 10 years. But anyway, that's a story for another time. So he starts off this article saying, they seem so like us. That is what makes it so shocking. Just, like saying it out loud, he really is. Ukraine is a European country. It's people who watch Netflix and have Instagram accounts, vote in free elections, and read uncensored newspapers. War is no longer something visited upon impoverished and remote populations. How did these wars get, what does he say, visited upon?
Yeah, that's very passive phrasing, isn't it?
Yeah. Wars was just the war in Iraq was just visited upon Iraq. Just had to happen, of course. It can happen to anyone. Yes, anyone. But the thing is, it already has happened to anyone because it has happened to places like Iraq and Afghanistan. But Daniel Hannan kind of implicitly there says, "Oh, those people, they don't count. They're not really anyone. They're not at the same level as us Westerners. What war isn't that big a deal over there because those people's lives mean less, basically."
Yeah.
And again, we continue with this theme with this video from Al Jazeera, which, again, this guy, he works for Al Jazeera, and even he's saying this. So let's have a look at what he has to say.
Population. And as you're talking to us, Matthew, we're playing in the latest pictures of some of the refugees trying to get on trains or trying to get out of Ukraine. And what's compelling is just looking at them, the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm loath to use the expression, these are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East that are still in a big state of war. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
Fuck off.
So you see, there's a difference between those refugees and, these refugees. The brown ones, basically, they're not middle class, so it's not the same, is it? It's not the same. But even when, the brown refugees from the Middle East, even when they have things like mobile phones and, appear middle class, which of course some of them were, well, it just shows that they don't need that much help. That is the narrative when middle class refugees from those countries escape war in places like Syria and Iraq. But over here, these Europeans, well, we need to help them basically because they look like us, Michael. They look like us. They don't deserve this situation. Is again the implicit narrative that is being said.
Yeah, it does seem like there's this weird attitude because I remember the comment about Netflix, which was said a bit in one of the videos earlier, and I was just thinking about that. Like, people in like Africa watch and like India and stuff watch Netflix. It's not as if like only Europeans have like a middle class kind of people who are doing well for themselves, and of course those places also get hurt badly by war. But again, there's no expectation that people from the middle class people in Syria, middle class people in Nigeria, middle class people in lots of places that do have quite serious conflict happening there can just go to the West as refugees. And certainly if they did, they wouldn't get some kind of sympathetic narrative. But definitely there's very much a entirely sympathetic narrative for these middle class people leaving Ukraine. And yes, it does seem to be because they are white Europeans.
Yes, because they look like us. Also, I want to contrast these two images from the Times in a newspaper in the UK as well to further illustrate this divide. So here we have one image on the left which says migrant ferry across the Mersey and Corbyn cruises, and is Jeremy Corbyn steering the ship going ahoy with a load of people who don't exactly look white on the ship, barely hanging off. The danger of Jeremy Corbyn bringing in all these brown people to the UK, and then there's the cartoon on the right, which is Priti Patel shouting at a Ukrainian who has a baby in her arms, and the building is on fire. And Priti Patel is saying, "I said, are you willing to pick fruit?" implying that Priti Patel is being incredibly harsh on this Ukrainian refugee. Because, of course, Britain banned Ukrainians from coming over here, which is, after lighting up Downing Street in a Ukrainian flag and doing that, that's just the most British thing ever, of course. But so on one hand, well, these brown refugees, that's really bad. Don't bring them over here. But oh, the Ukrainians, because again they look like us, oh, they should be given all the sympathy in the world for their situation, right?
No, yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's also worth noting that there is the fact that there was a lot of sympathy for like people from Hong Kong as well, which I think part of that is kind of geopolitical. The fact that it's the
that's anti-China.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But also, of course, I think if racists are okay with one race, it's probably like East Asians. So even then, for some reason, Hong Kong was doing okay, but they're at least light skinned in like East Asia, whereas lots of other places in South Asia and Africa and the Middle East really wouldn't get anything like as much sympathy. So it does seem like even then the narrative still holds.
And I think we should save the best, or maybe the worst to last, the most explicit version of this. So this is an interview on the BBC. A man is being interviewed by Ross Atkins, and here's what he has to say about the situation in Ukraine.
Me, I'm sorry, it's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles and his helicopters and his rockets.
And so, of course, I understand and respect the emotion. What you are outlining there is this tension between longer-term efforts to apply pressure to Vladimir Putin, such as financial sanctions, and the very immediate military threat which you're experiencing.
There you go. I mean, he just said it out loud, didn't he? Blonde hair and blue eyes. It's harder to see those kind of people suffer compared to other people across the world who don't have blonde hair and blue eyes. And Ross Atkins, who was the guy doing the interview, he's a very serious BBC journalist. He's the guy that explains everything like in a rational way. Just doesn't push back on that at all. Just lets that be said. And it's the we mentioned the war in the Balkans and Yugoslavia earlier. It's very similar apparently to what was said back then as well. It's just it has really been eye-opening. The quiet bit which many people suspected has finally been said out loud. What I think back actually to what Ben Shapiro said with Arabs, they like to live in their own filth. Remember that?
Yeah.
And that is actually, maybe they wouldn't be so explicit in saying that, but that's how a lot of the Western media does seem to feel about the Ukrainian situation compared to other wars across the world. Brown people being bombed is kind of a natural thing, and it happens. That's just the kind of thing that goes on in that part of the world. And therefore, the victims, of that have less sympathy, and they're not allowed in the European countries as refugees. And it is, like I said, it has been very illuminating to see the reaction from the Western media thanks to this Ukraine conflict, wouldn't you say, Michael?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it seems like obviously the hypocrisy was pretty obvious and the kind of racist motivations seem to be equally obvious at this point, that it's basically just, well, of course, you're going to have all of this conflict in these gross, smelly, places filled with all the foreign people, all the brown people, because that's just what they do. They fight each other. But us Europeans, we're better than that. It does seem to be the logic.
Yeah, no, you're right. And again, I will mention the reason why there's wars in those countries is often because of us, because of the civilized countries in the West. But anyway, Michael, we're going to get onto how the right-wing media has covered, this Ukrainian invasion. And of course, they've been trying to fit it into this bullshit culture war that they're doing, that everything has to be framed under. So let's go to this first clip here.
Look, Russia is now being canceled. Right? I mean, between the fierce Ukrainian resistance and the widespread international financial sanctions and boycotts and Russian teams being barred from international competitions, Russia is being canceled.
Russia is being cancelled, Michael. It has been cancelled. It's not allowed to star in any more Hollywood movies anymore or TV shows. It's not allowed to do that.
I know. It's really funny actually, because I saw this tweet that was like as a joke, like, have they considered looking at Putin's problematic Twitter history? That might be better than sanctions. And I mean, I guess that's like that being said, like that same kind of idea being said unironically on a American news station.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy. I have often wondered how far will this cancelling thing go, and apparently it can even apply to countries as well. But anyway, last clip of the day. This is a funny clip from Papa John, who of course used to own Papa John pizzas. So this is what he had to say on the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Biden administration, totally incompetent, or they do this intentionally. When you cut off our pipeline and you open up Russia's and you give the guy $750 billion, looks to me like it's pretty intentional. But what a great smokescreen. What a great distraction from all the real issues here that are affecting Americans. So I think it's smokescreen. I think it was intentional.
So there you go. Biden intentionally caused Putin to invade Ukraine to create a great smokescreen, to create a distraction from all the real issues here affecting Americans, like, you know, imaginary vaccine mandates. That's the thing. A lot of the right-wing Americans do seem to be obsessed with bullshit culture war issues, which is why that clip is funny. But again, the overall issue regarding fucking Putin being told by Biden, I guess, to invade Ukraine, it's wild. I mean, the American right wing are in a difficult position here, really, because they kind of like Putin because he's like a white nationalist, but also, you know, oh, it's Russia, they're the enemy, and they're doing something which is clearly like wrong. So they're in a tough position, and they have to, I guess, get themselves out of this position by creating this conspiratorial BS. That's the only way it can work for them, right?
No, yeah, and I mean, I do agree. That's probably it. Like, they have to find some way of fitting into their narrative, and that's the best they could arrive at. But I also just love the kind of self-obsessedness of that you have these two countries at war, and this guy's just like, this must be about America. I think this guy, Papa John, is definitely, and to be honest, America in general a lot of the time, is seriously suffering from main character syndrome.
Yes, absolutely, main character syndrome. I would not disagree with that. You know, Americans, they always have to make everything about themselves, and yeah, this Ukraine thing has proven that is still the case. So yeah, there we go. I think we have shown in this video that the hypocrisy of the West, that they in fact can oppose wars, the racism of the West as well, and also, yeah, the craziness of the right wing. You know, even that doesn't stop with the whole Ukraine and Russia war. But yeah, this is the end of the video. Hope the conflict is wrapped up soon, and yeah, the Russians just stop it, but doubt that'll happen. But yeah, see you next time, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.